All right, welcome to Dive into World Building. And here we are talking with Marie Brennan, and we're very excited to see you. After some adventures getting this all arranged, here we are. Yay.
It's good to be here.
So today we're going to talk about Driftwood because it just came out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
last week or this week?
About a week and a half ago, because it actually released on a Friday, which is very strange to me.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So this is a really interesting book. So did you have like big discussions about how to characterize it genre-wise? I mean,
I don't know. I think it helped a little bit, like, because it's coming out from Tachyon Books and, they're a small publisher, I think they've got sort of more leeway to kind of do the weird things than a more big, whatever number it is now, publisher does. They put out a lot of things that are kind of quirky novellas and short novels and things like that. And so, yeah, I went to talk with them about doing some kind of project. It was open at the time what it would be. And I mentioned that I'd been thinking about at some point taking the Driftwood short stories I'd already written and doing a collection of them with maybe some new stories to go with it. And somewhere along the line that turned into, well, what if instead of a straightforward collection, it turned into this kind of mosaic novel fix-up thing? And we did it that way. And that actually felt very appropriate for Driftwood because of the nature of the setting. So sure, I hopped on board with that. And it's been interesting watching how different reviewers describe it, because there is a certain amount of people aren't quite sure what box to drop it into.
Right, because there's a sort of post-apocalyptic aspect, and then there's a fantasy aspect, and there's a lot going on.
yeah, and it's very just cool. For people who haven't heard of this, the setting is one, the tagline for it is where worlds go to die, because it's basically after worlds have their apocalypse, the remnants that still survive kind of float through cosmic whatever and fetch up into this mass of fragmented realities that is Driftwood, where they keep on continuing to break down and so forth. And so, yeah, I mean, it could be anything. Like, I could throw a fully science fictional world into the middle of that if I wanted to, and maybe someday I will.
Yeah, it's really quite an interesting world concept.
Given how each of the different worlds has its own physics and laws of nature, yeah, you could put a high science fiction civilization into Driftwood and it worked just fine.
Exactly. Yeah. And I have thought about doing that, and I've also thought about sticking worlds of mine from like other stories in there somewhere, but I haven't done that yet either. Maybe I just don't want to think about my worlds coming to an end like that.
Yeah.
But that's part of the whole ethos and theme of Driftwood. Like every world has its time and place and history until it comes to its end.
Yeah. Though to be fair, it is something that works best with setups where there is some kind of apocalypse in a metaphysical sense, like you've got Ragnarok or something along those lines, like Kali Yuga. Whereas if it were something like the world from the Memoirs of Lady Trent, like they don't have an eschatology like that, and so like how does that world even end? I don't know.
Oh, that would make me really sad if the Lady Trent verse wound up in Driftwood. It would just hit me in the heart a little bit.
Yeah, and also just like, when would it be coming to an end? Like, if it's thousands of years later, how would you even know that it's her world? Because all the countries would have changed and so on. Yeah. There's a lot of considerations that would go into it.
So if you don't mind, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the worlds that you've included in this concatenation?
So the part of the fun of it is that I know in general my impulse is toward, I want to create a world that feels like this very like rich and coherent tapestry of things, and then I write a drift world story and I just make shit up. Like, there is no requirement for me, and in fact there's almost an anti-requirement around having a fully like fleshed out world where I feel like I have answers to all the things about how does this function, because they're broken and maybe they don't function anymore. And so I can come up with just this one colorful idea and then not have to worry about ramifications elsewhere. Like there's a bit at the beginning of The Ascent of Unreason where the two characters are sitting in a world called Kie, and basically there's a passing comment about how most of what remains of Kie has been given over to the cultivation of this particular plant that produces a really useful fiber. And so they like eat some of it and they sell the rest, and like they build their buildings out of this fiber packed with mud to make walls, and like even the stuff they drink is like the fermented juice that is strained off during the extraction of the fiber. And there you go, you know everything I know about Kie at this point. Like, they've got this fiber thing going on, and I spit out a couple of cool details and I'm done. I do not have to make up the rest of the world beyond that, which is honestly kind of fun for me. Like it's a weird sort of, I don't know if Busman's holiday would be the right thing to call it exactly, but you know, instead of having to think up all of the consequences, I can just fling this out there and go with it.
Well, you know, I think it's kind of fun to talk about, because people often will say, well, you know, you're not allowed to do thus and so, or you're required to have a world in which you are blah 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 blah, right? But what this basically says is, well, it all actually depends on what your premise is, right?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, as much as,
hey, this all fell apart, so it's just fragmented pieces left, then that is the kind of context in which you could just go and run with it.
Exactly. And as much as I love the kind of anthropologically realistic world where, okay, there may be, you know, these magical elements, but they're still integrated into society in ways that feel plausible. I love that kind of thing. But I also would immediately agree that that is not the only kind of game you can play with world building. Like you can do a very structured, symbolic, allegorical kind of world, and that's also cool. That may not be what I write, but I would never try to tell anybody that that's not an equally neat thing to do with your world building.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we try to, we as in me and on all the people on the show that I've worked with, try to take an expansive view of what world building is.
Right.
And so, you know, this is not a place where I'm going to get all people who, you know, have these huge world Bibles and right. I mean, I've had those folks, but
yeah, and sometimes I am that person
who world build on the fly, or you know, various types of things.
Yeah.
So I'm taking notes.
I was like, you're pausing and looking off to the side there, and I'm like, I don't know, would I be distracting you from something?
No, it's not at all. It's just that I'm trying to make sure that I have the record of what we talked about. So this is fun. So even as you have fragmentary worlds, mm-hmm. you have a very in-depth view of how the people of those worlds view each other and talk about each other. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so the odd thing about Driftworld is that there is a sense in which it is a more kind of not exactly allegorical, like that would be the wrong term for it, but most of the worlds I create, I couldn't really tell you what they're about thematically in almost the, you know, you could write a paper about this sense. But Driftwood I can, because it's basically all about entropy and liminality, because it's all of these fragments mashed up against one another. And so, especially as you get into the center of Driftwood, it becomes a place that almost consists of nothing but borders and the crossing of borders. Mm-hmm. And then the entropy part is in stuff breaking down. And so, yeah, it becomes a really key thing for people in Driftwood that it's constantly the question of what is on the other side of your borders and how are you interacting with it, and have you just like given up on your borders entirely, and so on. And the stories do hit that in a variety of different ways. In fact, as I've gone along and written more of them, there's kind of started to be a bit of a conscious thing in my mind where I say, okay, well, like in A Heretic by Degrees, it starts off with a world that's still fairly new to Driftwood, and so it's still fairly big, and their king gave a decree that basically said, nothing exists beyond the borders of our world. All those things you thought have vanished are still there, don't talk about it. You know, trying to hold on to things in that sort of rigid and xenophobic way. So naturally then there's a character who has to go out into everything that he was told doesn't exist and deal with it. But then the Ascent of Unreason, Tolyat, in that has essentially like he's left his own world. He doesn't live there anymore. He lives somewhere else and kind of has made himself more connected to the drifter community, which is the term for people that don't necessarily belong to a specific world. Like maybe their parents or grandparents were from different worlds, and so they're the equivalent of mixed race essentially. And Toliat's more a part of that community in more of a like expat sort of fashion. And then, basically from story to story, trying to make sure that I'm not always repeating the same approach to those issues, but looking for ways to kind of take a different spin on them each time.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, paying attention to language, which I've come to realize is increasingly, I think, one of the things that's like, how can you tell you're reading a Marie Brennan story? Oh, it's because I pay attention to what languages are people speaking and how are they communicating with each other across language boundaries. Because I find it almost disappointing that so much fantasy doesn't really bother with that. Like, that's a missed opportunity, man.
Yeah.
Like, do something with that.
Yeah. Totally.
I'm trying to think of the last character I read of yours, who is monolingual, who was not like a side character just from another place, and I can't think of any. You're always talking about languages and how languages interact with inside of a character and how they use and choose their languages to communicate.
Yeah, I think it doesn't come up much in the Onyx Court books just because those are set in London. And so the multilingual characters tend to be the ones who are not from London or coming in from, France or China or wherever.
Yeah.
Right, the courts, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, that was a while ago at this point. So it's been a while
I didn't
since
think that far back, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
What were you gonna say?
I was just going to say, I am not fluent in anything other than English, but I have studied to one extent or another quite a few languages. So that's just a thing I find fun and fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And it puts at odds with our American experience, which is often overwhelmingly, at least for a lot of Americans, monolingual, which is just not the norm in the rest of the world. Like when I went to Nepal last year, for example, I found that there were like 50 languages in Nepal.
Yeah.
And our guides could speak like at least a dozen of them, plus English. It's like, what?
And Americans tend to feel like, oh my God, you speak another language? That's like a superpower. Like, no, actually, that's really normal for many people around the world.
It's super normal.
Yeah. But there's the joke, what do you call somebody who speaks 3 languages, trilingual? What do you call somebody who speaks 2 languages, bilingual? What do you call someone who speaks 1 language, American?
It's
kind of true. But you were going to ask something.
I mean, so how deep into the languages do you get in a context where your worlds are fragmentary?
Very little. Like in Driftwood, I don't give more than like a word here, a word there of, there's a specific term for this type of thing which doesn't exist in another world, so it needs its own term. And even then, sometimes I'll just name them with, like there's a plant that they use to wash dishes, which just gets called rinseweed because it's with it. And so, I'm not always making up terms for stuff, though sometimes I do. And interestingly, like my big adventures in conlanging and actually trying to construct a language, all date back to high school. I basically haven't done it since then. In high school, I was studying both Spanish and Latin, and kind of sort of trying to learn Irish Gaelic on the side, which let me tell you does not work well when all you have is like a dictionary and the lyrics to some songs. I ended up studying it more formally in college, and then I did a little better. But so I think I was basically just entertaining myself while I was bored in class by sitting there and inventing languages for a setting that I was working on, which is actually the 9 Lands. I put out a collection recently of the 9 Lands stories that I have published. And in those stories, you see basically nothing of the conlanging I was doing because I feel like 99% of the time, putting a lot of work into that is something you do for its own sake and for the pleasure of creating it, and not because it's super useful to the story.
The problem with conlangs is that your story kind of has to be in a language that's comprehensible by your audience.
So, and I have heard, though, I've never actually read it. I really need to fix this. Watership Down. I'm told that the way it gets presented there means that by the end of the story, there's a moment where a line gets delivered in that language, and by then you know what it means and you don't need it translated.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's a very specific game to play and not one every author is going to be able to pull off or even wants to put in the effort for. So yes, most of the time I'm only paying attention to kind of stabbing in the general direction of a coherent looking set of phonemes so that if I name a couple of things, they sound like they might come from the same world.
Mm-hmm.
That's about as far as I go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, like how much of the conline do you really want to do? Unless for some reason somebody's coming to you and saying, I'm putting this on a video screen, right?
Yeah.
Unless you do that, there's really not a point.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody comes to me and says we want to make a TV show or a movie of this stuff, like, talk to us about the language, I will happily give them what I have worked out, which is stuff about phonology for the most part, and like naming conventions and such. And then for the rest of it, I will say, awesome, go find one of those linguists who does this stuff now for movies and TV, and they will make a better thing than I could possibly make. Yeah. I love that that's like an actual job that people have now. Like, there are linguists, not very many of them, I think, but there are linguists whose job is make up languages for TV and movies and like video games and such. Yeah,
absolutely. They're out there. I mean, I think David Peterson is like the salient example at this point, but he's not alone.
Yeah.
So it's pretty cool. Awesome. So do you want to tell us a little bit about sort of the plot? Here we are, like we've got this amazing setting, and like, what is this setting meant to carry?
I mean, that's an interesting, like, it's appropriate that that's not the first thing we talk about, because it's also sort of not the first thing that it's about. I mentioned before, I had written these Driftwood short stories, and what we ended up doing was creating, fix up is a term that you don't hear very often anymore, but it's when you take short stories and then you kind of rework them into some form of novel. And so what we did for this one is there's a frame story around the short stories, which is that this recurrent character who shows up in all of the stories, a guy that just gets referred to as Last because he's the last survivor of his world, which went away a long time ago, and he should have been dead a really long time ago. And so apparently he's immortal, only nobody really knows what's up with that, including Last himself. So the frame story is that a rumor goes around that he has actually died. And so people are gathering to kind of like try to find out what happened, and also to hold like something of a memorial for him. And that gives the context for these short stories, because one by one, people are coming up to the front of this gathering and telling stories about their encounter with Last, or maybe like a relative's encounter or something that happened back in their history. Because I had to take these stories and decide what order they had happened in. Not a thing I'd ever thought about before. And then the frame story itself is building up kind of this mystery of like what happened to him and why, and that ends up tying in with I wrote a new novelette, a longer story for this fix up, and so what's going on in the frame story ends up connecting with what happens in that novelette, which is essentially, it's called The God of Driftwood, and it's about a cult that started worshiping Last as the God of Driftwood. Like they're convinced that he is a deity, and he is in fact the deity of Driftwood, and so they worship him. He has opinions about this. Yes. Those opinions are mostly, I forgot to ask if any swearing was permitted on here. I think I've
totally, go ahead.
Yeah, but his opinions are, as they say, unprintable. He does not like people worshiping him. But so that's kind of the plot, but as you can tell, it's not really like there's a strong driving plot in the way that a conventional novel would have. Mm-hmm. And actually, I mentioned it's been interesting seeing how reviews react to this, because by and large, the reviews I've seen have been incredibly positive. Partly, I think, because a setting that's all about, like, how do you hold on to what's important to you in the face of disaster is a little more topical than I wanted it to be at the moment. Yeah. But it's been neat seeing how people react to the structure of this, because I've seen a number of people saying like, oh, and I really want to read like a proper novel in this setting. And that's something that people have been saying to me since I published the first of the Driftwood stories. A lot of people had been fans of it and wanted a novel. And yet there's a part of me that looks at the nature of the setting and goes, but a novel is a big, coherent, well-integrated thing. which is the opposite of what this setting is. And so I feel like the fix-up was actually the perfect way to do a Driftwood novel, that it should be a thing composed out of fragments that are held together by these common threads. It seemed very fitting, even though I know some readers, found that less satisfying because they want that big coherent story, which I understand.
I don't know. I was charmed that because you don't see a lot of fix-ups anymore. I mean, that's back from when I was reading 30 years ago. So to come across you do a fix-up like, wow, this is a blast from the past. But yet, as you say, it makes sense because Driftwood itself is this coherent.
Driftwood itself is a fix-up.
It's a fix-up, yes.
Yeah, that is exactly what it is. Like, it is a fix-up setting, so naturally a fix-up novel. But no, you're right. I don't think they're very common anymore. And I suspect a lot of that has to do with, among other things, just kind of the changing landscape of short fiction publishing. Because it used to be much more that you could publish a bunch of short stories that were like linked in a setting in the same magazine. And then that was your groundwork for making your fix-up novel. But I feel like it's harder to reliably sell. I mean, even for me, most of the Driftwood stories have appeared in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, but like one of them was in the Intergalactic Medicine Show and one of them was in a charity anthology. So I think it's harder to really build up a body of connected stories like that than it used to be.
No, I agree entirely. Short fiction is very different than it was back 30 years ago.
And I think the flip side of that is also that our expectations of novels are different, because now it's pretty rare to publish an adult novel, at least, that's shorter than 80,000 words. And here's Tachyon putting out this book for me that's like 42,000. So like it's a novel by the benchmark of award limits, but how often do you see a 40,000 word novel these days?
Yeah, not too often.
So you would need to publish a lot of short stories in order to make a fully sized fix-up now.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because what you see with the shorter lengths is that it's for younger people.
Right. Yeah. Middle grade novels are shorter. Young adult are still sometimes shorter, but not always anymore.
Yeah. Interesting. So over how long a period of time did you write these works?
All told, I want to say something like 18 years, because I published actually, let me check real quick. I'm going to put my own website here because that's the easiest way for me to answer these questions. Strangely, A Heretic by Degrees was actually the first story published, though it was the second one written. That one, just, with the vagaries of submitting stuff, that came out in 2008, and then Driftwood came out in 2010, so that's 12 years. But if I go look at when I wrote them, I originally drafted the first Driftwood story back in 2004, so 16 years to go from me writing the first bits of it and then all the way to the book coming out. I actually hadn't been writing much stuff in Driftwood for a little while, just because I drifted out of writing short fiction in general for a while. I really kind of slacked off on that.
You mentioned before that you had to figure out where they all fit in a timeline. Did you have any difficulties? I know there's not a lot in the stories that might cause contradiction, but did you have any difficulties in trying to arrange them in a temporal order?
The difficulty was basically, yes, I did have difficulties. None of it had to do with any sort of continuity, because I don't have any overlap of mentioning a world in one story and then it shows up in another one further along in the process of decay. They're all, disconnected in that sense. So the question ended up being, all right, in terms of mood and what's going on with them, how can I make sort of an arc for the reader in going through these rather than just kind of ricocheting around randomly? And so in particular, Remembering Light is one of the most kind of melancholy stories, because in it, Last comes right up to the edge of doing something that would cause him to basically forget where he came from, because he's tired of carrying around that memory. And so it felt like, okay, that one should go right before, like that's the most recent one, because then if there's this story going around of he's vanished, he may be dead, that feels like it naturally follows out of that. And then also we did have difficulty with the fact that the very first story I wrote, the one that is also called Driftwood, and then a little flash piece that I had written just for my website as like an extra for readers, Both of those have Last's point of view in them, and none of the other stories do. All the rest of them are told from the perspective of someone who encounters him, but don't get his direct viewpoint. And so in terms of figuring out how to fit them into the framework of the fix-up, that gave us nightmares, actually. Like, that was a giant pain in the neck. It's why you get that original story first in the book, and then you get a little snippet of text that contextualizes everything else that follows as some manuscript that somebody had written down of this gathering that happened and the stories that people told there. But that's why that first one just kind of like sits off on its own at the beginning, because it couldn't be integrated with the others. It didn't fit into there. And so there was a lot of...
That's why you did it that way. I was wondering, okay.
Yeah, like, it's not the most elegant solution, but the alternative was we leave that one out entirely, which also didn't seem like a great idea. So, that was the best of a bad situation, basically, because there was no other way to really make it fit in there.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's a very sort of advanced writing project, isn't it?
I feel like it does come with a little sticker on it saying, like, professional driver on a closed course, do not attempt.
Right? Do not attempt.
Because there are certain things that I and not just like stuff that I've written, but other things that I read sometimes where I look at it and I go, this thing that this author did is amazing, and I could never in good conscience recommend to a writing student that they try to do that. Like a stylistic thing or a structural one or whatever. Some things you're like, they're off the beaten path, and when they work, they're amazing. They do not always work.
Yeah. It's like super challenging things that if you can get them right.
Yeah. Or got like one thing that I will never do again. And now I say that I probably condemned myself to do it again at some point. But I wrote a short story at one point that is entirely in Anglish, which is one of the terms for English using only words from Germanic roots.
Oh.
It's
like
22...
Like Uncleftish Beholding.
Exactly. Uncleftish Beholding is like the most kind of famous instance of somebody trying to do this. And the story is 2,200 words long, and every last one of them was like pulling teeth.
Oh my
and
goodness.
Literally because I mean, at one point I was like, okay, well, it's taking forever if I stop and look everything up as I'm writing it. So, maybe I'll just write the story and then go back and fix the prose. Only that doesn't work either, because the feeling of the story and everything about the shape of it is also shaped by the language. So I kind of did my best, and then I sat down with a printout of it, and I literally went through, like, crossing out each word as I got to and saying, okay, I've checked that one, and finding things like, we don't have a word for courage or bravery that's not ultimately from a Latin root, or like Norman French, that kind of route. Or the word face. Face, this is not a Germanic word, and what other word do we have that is this thing right here, which isn't from that kind of root? So, God, it was nightmarish. 2,200 words, not a very long story, still too long. I'm very proud of it. It was, great, and I sold it to one of Mike Allen's Clockwork Phoenix anthologies because he loves that kind of stylistic, stunt writing, basically. But I hope to God I never try to do that again, because it was a pain in the ass.
Well, I mean, yeah, it just sounds like a really painstaking and
emphasis on
painstaking requirement that would require you to invest a lot of energy in the process of putting it together.
Yeah. So cool experiment. Don't want to do it again. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you have like Marie Brennan who does the stories where she uses only the words that were used by Jane Austen.
Yeah, and I mean, I did a lower grade version of that with the Onyx Court stuff. Like, I would periodically go and look up words, going a bit more on instinct of, like, this feels to me like it's kind of modern. Like, I couldn't talk about a character being paranoid, for example. Like, that's a very modern term. But I didn't full on go into the, like, okay, no, I'm going to restrict myself to the vocabulary of the 16th century. I think for Marie Brennan, it was a little bit easier. Well, not easier, but Jane Austen has been so comprehensively studied that it's fairly easy to, get that information on hand. And I think she basically set up like a customized dictionary in Word or whatever program she's using to sort of flag that for her. But I would have had to do a different one for every century of the Onyx Court, and I wasn't doing that.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
But I did have the Oxford English Dictionary open in a tab for about 4 years straight as I was checking things. So.
That's pretty funny.
It felt weird when I finally closed that tab. I was done writing the series. I'm like, okay, I can shut this tab. I've had it for years.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's what a project. So so I guess we could maybe switch gears a little bit here. How about, are there any other questions that you have about Driftwood that you want to touch on? Anyone, including Marjorie, before we
Or
move
Morgan, who have been quiet.
I've been quiet. No.
I'm driving, so it's hard for me to do that.
Oh yes,
That's
please
totally
be safe, Marjorie.
okay.
Yes, be
Glad
safe.
you're here.
Safety, top priority.
Exactly. You got to keep her safe. So you mentioned earlier that you might want to talk about some teaching that you were doing.
Yeah, 2020 has been interesting in that it's kind of been my year of diving back into teaching, which I used to do more of, because when I was in graduate school, I was a TA for various classes. And then in my last year there, I actually got to teach 2 classes of my own design, one of which was on creative writing, and the other one was on like retellings of fairy tales. And then Duke has a program called TIP, the Talent Identification Program, which for people who know John Hopkins' CTY thing, instead, it's a very similar kind of deal. Basically, like 7th graders take the SAT, and if they score high enough, then they're eligible to take a 3-week summer course. And I did a bunch of these when I was a kid. And so at one point I got contacted about like pitching a course idea for TIP. And then there was sort of a second stage, which is after they decide what courses they want to do, then they were taking applications from the teachers. And when I had my phone interview to teach the course that I had pitched, basically 5 minutes into it, the woman was talking like, okay, yes, it's a given that I would be teaching. And I did go teach it. It was an amazing experience, actually, because 12 and 13-year-olds are just sponges. And, these are like gifted kids who have signed up to take this course in their summer vacation. So they want to be there. They're actively engaged. And it was a really, really great experience. But I did that back in, I think, 2013 or so. And by then I was no longer in graduate school. So I kind of stopped teaching for a time. But then this year, I went and did a 1-day fight scenes workshop for Clarion West in February, right before things started to lock down. I did an online version of that workshop for Cat Rambo's Academy, and I'm going to be doing that again later this year. And then when Clarion started doing all of their online workshops, I kind of had this moment of going, okay, they want little 1-hour things. And I've wanted for a long time to figure out how to teach a world building workshop, and it keeps on not being wrangleable into a workshop sized and shaped thing, but a 1-hour thing. Rather than teaching a world building workshop, I can take a topic. I can say, okay, we are going to have 1 hour where we talk about clothing. And we're going to have 1 hour where we talk about food and things like that. Or like a 1 hour religion. Yeah, like a 1 hour religion workshop. And so I boiled it down to, I proposed and ended up teaching 4 1-hour workshops on different bits of world building for them. And then proceeded to do a 6-hour kind of broader world building thing, which, let me just say, 6 hours of teaching online. That is tiring.
Yeah.
And so I've kind of been experimenting with figuring out how to tackle this subject in workshop-y kind of format by doing it a little bit, 1 bit at a time, which has been helpful, because part of the problem I run into is any kind of broad overview deal I wind up feeling is almost like too broad and general to be super useful. Like you'll hit kind of these basic points of like, think about what the religion of the world is, and we're going to spend half an hour on that and then move on. And like, there's so much to dig into there, rather than just saying like, okay, come up with a few gods and we're done. So I really like being able to instead take it in more like modular bites. That's been helpful.
Like your essays.
Yeah, which the workshops I've been putting on under the header of building new worlds, because the Patreon is the New Worlds Patreon.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually exactly the same sort of impulse that for an even longer time than I've wanted to run a workshop on this, I've wanted to write a book on world building. And I kept on running into the wall of just like, how do I organize it? How do I approach it? How do I make a book shaped object out of this? And I could not figure out how, until at one point the notion of having a Patreon came up. And I went, oh, like if I did it that way, then instead of trying to write a book, which requires a structure and organization and things like that, I could instead write weekly essays. And in that format, I can just hit things in whatever order feels good, whatever order my patrons vote for, sure, like let's just ricochet around. And then after I've written those things, then I can take it and I can make a book.
And you can fix it up.
Yep, it's a fix.
Yes, I can fix it up. The punchline to this is I'm now 3.5 years into this project, and we're not done yet. By my current estimate, I probably have about another 2.5 years, give or take, to go before I will have run out of things to discuss. At this point, I've got 3 books on world building because I've been putting together yearly collections from the Patreon, where I just take the stuff we talked about in that year, and I put it into the best order those topics can be shuffled into, and then I put it out there. My plan is, when this is all done, I'm going to go back and reorganize them into a smaller number of larger volumes that will be like the complete new worlds, where I'll kind of expand on things a little bit, like re-edit them, and probably group them where there will be like one book about matters of the physical world, one book about like social structures and institutions and relationships and such, and then one on more like, I think of them as mental topics, where it'll be things about like maybe art and so forth, and magic and language and books and that kind of stuff. So that's the long-term plan here, because I couldn't figure out how to write a book, and so I'm going to write like a whole bunch of them is apparently the answer to this question.
I love it. My daughter's in 10th grade. She's been writing a book probably for the last 2 summers, working on world building and stuff like that. She was really rather bummed that they weren't going to have a creative writing course in school this year. Last year, she took screenwriting, so she was able to basically look at it a different way. I'd love to see those books. That sounds really, really right up her alley.
Yeah, they're like I said, there's 3 yearly collections out so far, and so they're obviously a little bit eclectic in terms of topics, because for the first couple of years, I offered patrons the opportunity to request a topic, and very few people actually did that. So I switched over to making polls, and now I give them a chance to vote, and that's worked much better. But it means that they bounce around a little bit. The coherent organization will have to come after it's all done.
Makes
Those are
sense.
easier to engage with.
Yeah.
Rather than,
I kind of need to see the whole
sticking
octopus.
myself out there. Like, yes, I want you to talk about this. It's easier to vote for something that I know you want to do because it's on your poll.
Yeah, as soon as I thought about doing polls, I was like, that's a much better way of structuring this, because a completely open field of, hey, what do you want to know about, is much harder to navigate than, here, have 5 options. Which of these sound cool?
Yeah, for sure. Can you tell us anything about what you're working on right now?
A whole bunch of things, actually. Like I've been remarkably busy of late, because I just had Driftwood come out, and then I've got 2 books coming out early next year. One of them, I think Juliet and I were talking about me coming back with my co-writer Alyssa Helms, because we, under the joint name of M.A. Carrick, are doing the Rook and Rose trilogy, which is something Paul is apparently looking forward to. It's epic fantasy. I only semi-jokingly refer to it as When Anthropologists Attack, because Alyssa and I are both anthropologists. We actually met on an archaeological dig in Wales when we were both undergrads. And so it's got all of that like full tapestry world building that I mentioned earlier on. We've had a lot of fun with that, and with like finding ways to really integrate that with the story and have it drive the story in some, we hope, cool fashions. And then probably the month after that, in February, I've got a Legend of the Five Rings novel coming out called The Night Parade of 100 Demons, which is based on, or inspired by a bit of Japanese folklore. And I've also been doing better with short fiction in the last couple of years. In particular, earlier this year, I managed to write a couple of Onyx Court short stories, which I hadn't done in ages. Working on one right now that's a fun secondary world thing where I'm getting to have sort of a lower grade version of the Driftwood thing because it's not like meant to be fragmentary, but also because it's short fiction, it doesn't have to have the scope that a novel's world building does. And so I'm going through and being like, okay, my starting concept was basically Library of Alexandria and also the Confucian examination system. So like, let's mash those into a world together. And I want this character being from a religious minority. So I think she's kind of like Zoroastrian and just getting to really mix things up there in fun ways. That's actually the draft I'm working on right now because Alyssa and I finished the second Rick and Rose books. Now I get to play with things that are not 200,000 words long.
Yeah, that is definitely a lot to hold in one's head at the same time.
Oh yeah. Even holding it in two people's heads, like outsourcing a little bit, it's still a lot.
That's true. That's true. Like the amalgam entity that is a character.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's see. Yeah, I've asked a lot of the questions that I want to ask, and we are getting towards the end of the hour. Do you have a research focus right now that you're particularly pursuing, something that you're geeking out about?
Yes and no, because actually what happened in the last year or so, I've been also doing a lot more reading than I had for a while, which was very, very nice. And what I actually found was that looking back over my nonfiction reading for a decade or more, kind of what happened was I wrote the Onyx Court books where I had to do very in-depth research on British history and then on specific topics like astronomy or whatever that were relevant to the plot. And so that was about 4 years where the only nonfiction reading I really did was for research for the books that I was writing in this very sort of narrow way. And then I was writing the memoirs, and it was broader there because Isabel is traveling from place to place. And so I was reading about different areas. But it was still a lot of very directed reading. Like, okay, she's going to kind of the Polynesian region now, so I'm going to read about Polynesian culture. And I realized in hindsight that what I had lost was what I had when I was in school, both as an undergrad and a grad student, which was just throw stuff into the hopper. Like things from all around the world and all kinds of different time periods, just chuck it all in there and like feed the compost heap. Because I've taken this to describing myself as an anthropological compost heap from which stories sprout. And so it's honestly the best description of myself as a writer I've come up with. So, you know, but what I have actually aimed to do over the last like 6 to 9 months is to get back to that throw things into the hopper approach. So I've just been kind of looking at my shelves and going, you know, here's a book I haven't read yet. And so in the early stages of it, I like finally finished a book I'd been reading on Pompeii. And then I went and read one about Kublai Khan and like China during his reign. And then I read one that was on certain aspects of like women's lives in different Native American tribes. And then I don't even remember what came after that, but it's been that kind of thing where I'm trying to read as just broadly and kind of deliberately randomly as possible. Though there's a bit of an asterisk on that, which is that I recently read 3 different books on daily life in China in different time periods because I'm trying to improve my grasp of like the scope of Chinese history and understanding how things changed over time and how they fit together. So I've been making some amount of effort to fill in that particular gap in between reading random other things.
Cool. All right. Well, you know, we do not have to go blasting through 5 o'clock. Do we have any questions?
I have plenty of questions. I mean, I could talk to Marie for a long time. So what? How was it different for you writing with Alec versus writing solo? I don't recall any previous collaborations you've done, or am I wrong?
I mean, I kind of have, but not of this type, because I did work on one Serial Box project, Born to the Blade, which that was Yeah. So that was with 3 other writers, but that's a different kind of collaboration because that's one where like we got together for a weekend to hash out the plan for the season, because Serial Box divides things up in kind of a TV metaphor. And then after we had hashed out the arc of that, we each got assigned episodes, so these like novelettes that make up the whole season. We each got assigned episodes to go write, and then we go away and we write those. And we would read each other's episodes and offer feedback and such and revise our own to account for what's happening elsewhere. But on the whole, it was a much more, okay, I write my bit, you go write yours, which is very different from how Alyssa and I have been writing the Rook and Rose stuff, where in that one, we're going back multiple times during a scene, just like tossing the ball back and forth of I'll write a bit, Alyssa writes a bit, and so on. And then the other kind of collaboration I have been doing is writing for Legend of the Five Rings, but that's again a very much more siloed thing. The company has a story team that steers the overall narrative, and then we each get assigned individual stories to write, and I write my story, separate from other people's. So, I may write something that follows on the events of someone else's story, and I need to pay attention to that, but it's not the degree of close collaboration that we've been doing. However, and I imagine we'll talk about this more next time, so I won't go into too much detail. We came into this from writing scenes for a role-playing game that I was playing in and Alyssa was running, where it was like, oh, we want to do this side thing that's not going to involve any of the other players, so let's just write it as a scene rather than making them all sit there while we run it in game. And that's actually how we wound up in that pattern of writing, just tossing it back and forth in a Google Doc throughout the scene. Rather than doing it the way I know other authors do, where it will be like, I write a chapter, you write a chapter. It's much more integrated.
And I seem to recall way back when you and Al are talking about this being the secret project, and then suddenly the secret project's been sold. Hooray!
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, we definitely took the approach of deciding to write the first book on spec because we wanted to make sure we could do that before we wound up contractually obligated to do that. It seemed like a good move, but we get a little way into it and we're like, but we can't not talk about it because we're super excited. So that was why I started doing the progress reports on the secret project, because we were way too excited by what we were doing to keep it completely under our hats the whole time.
I mean, I've enjoyed both of your work, so I'm really excited to see how you guys collaborate together.
I'm really pleased with how it's turned out in ways that I think we both kind of pushed each other to do better than we do individually, kind of pushed each other to grow, basically, which is a good thing to do periodically.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Well, so I'm definitely looking forward to talking to you and Alyssa about that, and we will definitely make a date.
Yes.
California dreaming.
Yeah.
It will be closer to January though.
Yes. Yeah, because that's when the book's coming out.
Because it makes more sense to talk about it when it's about to come out.
Yeah. Well, and also I just, I'm here by myself and I certainly can talk about it, but I don't want it to seem like it is just a me show. It is definitely something that we both have pitched in on. So better to do that one when Alyssa's around to contribute their part.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so now it is 5 o'clock and we will wrap up. Thank you for the extra question, Paul. I know there's plenty of it out there to talk about. It just
I was like, I'm happy to answer more, but also I know that you guys, don't expect to run longer than this. So
yeah. So what we'll do is I will take us offline and then we can continue to talk after we're not live streaming.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Oh.